Welcome, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. My name is Kayla Magruder. I'm an admissions counselor here at the Tulane Celia Scott Weatherhead School of Public Health and Tropical Medicine. And today I have Dr. Lorelei Cropley with me. She's here to discuss her public health discovery seminar series titled Health Determinants of Indigenous Peoples. Some quick housekeeping rules. If anybody has any questions for Dr. Cropley, please drop them in the Q&A and we will address them all at the end. We will have a brief Q&A section, about 10-15 minutes at the end for any questions that you have about her presentation today. I just want to thank Dr. Cropley again for being here and providing us with this seminar today, and I will hand it over to you, Dr. Cropley.
Thank you so much, Kayla, and welcome. I'm very excited to be talking about this. It's one of my topics that I really and really inspires me. So first of all, just a little bit about who I am and what I'll be covering today. And we'll be talking about the health determinants of Indigenous people. I'll just go back to my bio. My name is Lorelei Cropley. I'm a doctorate in public health, also a certified health education specialist. And I didn't put up there, but I'm also an RN. And that takes me to my next slide, which is, oops, the next one after that. So today I'll be talking about my background, defining what Indigenous is and indigeneity, also why Indigenous people are important. Then we'll look at the determinants of Indigenous people's health and some of these themes underlying health inequities. And then some of these health metrics and how we address them kind of on a global scale, but also as an academic and a scholar. And then what I call headlight moments. And I can't wait to explain that because I picked up the term from an Indigenous leader and her name was, not joking, Wilma Mankiller. That's a great name. Then time for questions or comments. So a little bit of biography. If you go to my webpage, my site, my bio site on Tulane, it says I'm associate professor, doctorate in public health, but it also there, if you look down education affiliations, got my master's degree in community health at Tulane, my doctorate in international health, but I also have a bachelor's in science and nursing through Southeastern Louisiana University. And this becomes important because it led to my development of my beliefs and my practice around Indigenous people. And so let's talk a little bit about that. So I'm currently a clinical associate faculty for the undergraduate program. I teach the undergraduate classes in public health. Freshman classes often have freshman classes of 75 more. I started as a registered nurse, and then I got really interested in what was happening to patients outside of the hospital, which led to community health, getting my master's degree, health education, and health communication was a big part of my work. And then that led to medical anthropology, which is really an intersect between Indigenous, which led to the intersect between Indigenous and health, Indigenous beliefs in health. And to explain that, when you're developing a survey and you're asking about fever causation, you start learning that fever causation beliefs can be very different depending on which group you're working with, Indigenous group. And the definition of fever or the beliefs will often determine how they treat the fever. For example, if they treat it at home or they seek treatment outside the home. So it became very important to understand fever causation beliefs, to develop a measurement tool for example, a questionnaire that would capture this, but also when you're developing messages and communication to them, to use these beliefs to form those messaging. The other thing, for example, another one is getting the messaging correct. For the Mayan term, for example, for the insect that causes, it's a triatomide that causes Chagas disease, they call it pig, and pig is their term for it. And even health professionals will use the word pig for understanding their terms for the insect that causes certain diseases. And this led to my emergent scholarship and practice in health determinants of Indigenous people, and has led me to do things like be the faculty lead for a Health Equity Indigenous People Scholar Society, organizing service opportunities with Indigenous groups here in Louisiana, and other aspects of Indigenous scholarship and practice. So let's talk about who are Indigenous people. And this is kind of a great starting point because Indigenous people, who they are, the term, the definition is any ethnic group of people who live in a place where they're the earliest known inhabitants. And this is wrong. First of all, the word Indigenous comes from the word indigena, which means Latin, Latin for the terms for native, but sometimes they're not necessarily the first people there. Maybe they came there afterwards. We have the idea of indigeneity or indigenous. Just look at where they were at the first time of colonial contact, for example. This might have changed throughout times. There might have been different groups. So first doesn't make you indigenous. What happened before in the United States and in America is before 1492, there weren't really indigenous people, if you think about it. And the other thing is there's different terms used around the world. You'll heard terms such as First Nations or identifying Indigenous group by their own tribe or their own recognition, their own terminology. Who identifies Indigenous can vary over time. For example, in the 80s and 90s, because of a civil war and attacks against Indigenous people, some people were afraid to express their Indigenous roots. But after the post-96 peace accords, more people were able to identify as Indigenous. So this can change over time. So really, we look at indigeneity as identity. This can be in the term of language, culture, social, economic, political systems, maybe a place or territorial connection, but that is not necessarily you will always have a place or territorial connection because sometimes Indigenous people move around. So indigeneity then will be the person or group's identity that links them to a certain language, culture, social, economic. Sometimes we look at language, if they speak an Indigenous language, but because of the loss of Indigenous languages, we can't use that as a measurement of indigeneity anymore. So really important is how people Indigenous identify themselves. And sometimes they'll use their own name for themselves, but think of it as identity in language, culture, and practice. So let's talk a little bit about Indigenous in Louisiana. So it's kind of fun because when we say Indigenous in Louisiana, we're here in New Orleans, and many people who come to Tulane will learn that Bobanshe was the Choctaw word for New Orleans, and it means place of many tongues, many languages, which is great. We're a big meeting place. If you look at us, we have both. We're end of the Mississippi River, but also the Gulf region. So we have a lot of interaction here with different Indigenous groups. There's a wonderful painting. It's from 1735, de Batz, which is actually shows Bilbancha as the name on the very bottom edge. This is in the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnography at Harvard University. And working with an Indigenous scholar, Jeffrey Devensburg, he pointed out the different outfits of the different Indigenous groups to show there was a lot of diversity there. Just looking at, you can see some differences in their what they're wearing, what they look like, with the different weapons that they're carrying. So this was truly a meeting place of many different Indigenous groups, and that's a good name for it. Currently, though, in Louisiana, we're named after not an Indigenous name, but we do have 4 federally recognized tribes in Louisiana. They're federally recognized in the United States, but we also have 11 state recognized tribes. What does this mean? Well, the 4 federally recognized tribes can get federal funding for certain areas, and the 11 state recognized tribes or unrecognized tribes don't have that access. So if you look at these state recognized tribes, there's only 4, but several other state recognized tribes, and I have a list of them in the notes. And that's important because once again, if you're not one of these 4 federally recognized tribes, it may be harder to get funding for different areas, and including things such as climate change relief. Here's an example of somebody who's not in a federally recognized tribe. When I ask people, what do you think an Indigenous person looks like? They often think of them in different, maybe looking in kind of Indigenous clothing. Well, this is Devin Parfait, and he is the future chief of the Grand Dulac Band of the Biloxi Chickamauga Choctaw. And he's an Indigenous leader, and he's a chief. And so we look at him and say, wow, that's a chief. They look just like us sometimes. And they have, he does great things with indigenous Native youth community adaptation, climate change adaptation, coastal resilience. So, and yet he's in a tribe that's not federally recognized. So why they are important, and I loved it. I think there's a lot of reasons why they're important, but let me tell you a little bit about them. So first of all, there's about nearly 500 million people in the world that qualify as Indigenous or could be recognized as Indigenous. And one of the things we really are important in terms of climate change in the future is they own, occupy, or use about a quarter of the world's Earth's surface, but they safeguard, or guardians, as we call it, about 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity. And so with this, they carry a lot of ancestral knowledge, how to adapt, mitigate, and reduce climate change risks. But that is threatened by language loss. Language loss is a problem because, first of all, it's an identity for Indigenous people, but it also gives us this hard to tease out information about causation, like I mentioned with fever, or the name of an insect. So the loss of Indigenous language means often the loss of traditional knowledge and culture. And this is knowledge about ecosystems, health, plants that they use for treatment, traditional treatment practices, conservation. So estimates right now are about more than half the world's languages will be extinct by 2100. There are many people who are preventing this extinction or keeping languages alive. And that's a whole nother lecture. And just an example, in Brazil, only about 160 of the 1,000 indigenous languages are spoken that were in use before the arrival of the Portuguese. So I mean to say that they're guardians of both cultural and biological diversity, but also that knowledge that comes with it. And with that is also access to traditional knowledge and healing. So, for example, the knowledge and practice of using plants healing and treatment. Some of these have true pharmaceutical benefits that ethnobotanists tease out. We also have traditional birth attendants. We often have them trained so they can intersect with the medical systems. But the TBAs, as we call them, for example, in Guatemala, they attend about 31% of births nationwide, and actually 60% in regions with large indigenous populations. So very important in terms of different areas of healthcare. So let's go, we always look at lens of public health. So let me talk a little bit with lens of indigenous people. And I'm going to mention a neo-colonist lens, which is often how indigenous people are seen, which is not helpful for their understanding their health and determinants and what's behind those health determinants. First of all, the idea that indigenous people are visible and really the erasure of indigenous people. Just like I mentioned, the loss of federal recognition was important. But there's often national existence of legitimate existence is denied. Sometimes there's something kind of seen in the past. That's something they've been kind of, let's say, kind of erasure, which means moving them off their land, putting them in reservations. So not really present. Many people would not be able to name the recognized tribes in Louisiana or identify the communities that are here that they are living among. So the other thing is that they're poor and passive victims who need to be saved, not giving them the agency to take control of their own health problems and their health in general. So, for example, this often means that they consider their culture or their practices as backwards, or maybe contributing to their own poverty, without understanding that their poverty is often in response to colonization and some very historic depredations on their lives. So this idea that they're poor and passive, that they don't have agency, that they don't have their own ideas for addressing things like I mentioned with climate change is wrong. They're kind of quaint remnants of the past. This is when they get to be seen as the tourism industry promotes them as their culture and exploit them without the benefit. They look at them as kind of cultural, kind of tourism attractions, just taking the people to tour indigenous villages, for example, and commenting, pointing out their clothes, their representation and their what they wear. But also, for example, some of the quaint and remnants of the past that we appropriate, like for example, the dream catcher, for example, that this is something that people will take and use it as a spiritual connection or in different ways, but it's actually only really associated with one indigenous group, not all indigenous people, and it's kind of something that they don't necessarily all groups use, or if they did it in the past. There's also this idea that indigenous people are irrational obstructionists, and this is the idea that they are preventing development, that they are preventing, for example, they're on the wrong side of history. They want their own special rights, especially when they demand collective rights to their own land and resources. So when, for example, development is moving into an area that is owned and managed by indigenous people, when they want to resist that development, because the country is maybe saying this is going to be great economic gain, and they said, no, this is where we live and practice, and this is our land, they are seen as obstructionists. So this is often where they get to be seen as preventing development. So what is that? So another frame we look at is called a model of understanding social determinants. So social determinants are going to be different things that determine individual healths. So in this model, I really like this. We use this we adopt this a lot for theses and things like that. It's putting in the beginning families, not so much individuals. Indigenous people are often very collective thinking and thinking of the family and the group. So instead of individual, we put children, families, and then wider we see different things such as geography and land. Also, their self-determination, their autonomy, how they make decisions, their language and culture. Language, again, is coming up here. Their spirituality, some of the ways they treat people, for example, would be a very spiritual. What is the road you're on would be the translation of a Mayan greeting. And then a collective or traditional way of living. Often they have very collective land ownership and practice, so less on the individual, more collective. Some of the divergent, emergent themes that underlie these inequities, which these are, when I talk about Indigenous inequities, we're talking about globally. Okay, these are globally themes that we see repeated over and over again, not specific to one region or one area or one tribe. So first of all, the effects of globalization, of colonialization. Colonialism began the decline in health for Indigenous people. These were introducing unfamiliar diseases such as smallpox, which caused decimation, where 1 in 10 people died, but also displacing them from their ancestral land. And that leads to the next one, is a loss of their land and associated loss of resources, where they could no longer hunt and collect meat or fish or whatever there is in their diet because of being relocated. Also, in the United States, the decimation of the buffalo, which served a big purpose in certain groups. So they have a loss of resources. And these resources, for example, if traditional healers need the forest that they use to collect the plants, and when this is lost, it's hard to keep those practices going. And that moves to the next one, to the language and cultural barriers and loss. So we see language as being important, but however, we see many languages are being lost. And some of those cultural practices are being extinguished because, like I said, they're not necessarily fitting into, say, maybe more the health. We kind of sometimes a Western framework of medicine, medicine that's more focused on pharmaceutical or treatment versus some of the kind of practices they do that include power of belief. Here's a picture that many of my students sometimes don't even know was the residential boarding schools in the United States, where they removed children from their homes and put them in boarding schools to make them teach them English, teach them U.S. ways, American ways, and they even quote take the Indian out of them and make them a person. And just remember that former model that they put at the very beginning of it or middle of it, Indigenous children and their families, and yet here we're removing U.S. removed children from their families, and that caused great disruption and loss that they are still experiencing the results, the outcomes from today. So let's look at the health determinants. And one of the things that we see over and over again, every country studied, every country, was that Indigenous people are poor. So they are more likely to be poor, they're more likely to be ethnic minorities. And the poverty head count is much larger than the non-Indigenous poverty and a much larger poverty gap. And this will manifest its way in many different health outcomes. But the way that this also manifests itself is with poverty, you often don't have power. So this means that they're vulnerable to land and property rights. They're often discriminated against. They also have heightened vulnerability to different threats such as disasters, hurricanes and things like that, but also access to education and other aspects that they may be marginalized from. So they're about 6% of the global population, account for about almost 20% of extreme poor. I just mentioned exclusion and marginalization. Sometimes this often leads to a lack of equal access to basic health care. So for example, I'll give you this one. In Latin America, the Indigenous population's access to water and sanitation, electricity is 15% lower for sanitation and 18% lower in electricity. And this is going to be higher in some communities. So they don't have equal access to basic health services such as water and sanitation. And on the right is a poverty reduction through time for Indigenous and non-Indigenous. And pretty much you see the trends in all countries except China. China's the outlier here, where the reduction of poverty to meet sustainable development goals, we call them global goals by 2030, to eliminate poverty, we see that we're much more on track with non-Indigenous groups than Indigenous to reduce poverty. So let's look at some other health indicators. Life expectancy. We often use life expectancy as a general indicator, but the life expectancy is up to 20 years lower than life expectancy of non-Indigenous people. This is due to many different reasons, but one of the reasons why will be a higher infant mortality rate. Not only the life expectancy, but Indigenous people suffer from poor health, more likely to have a reduced quality of life, and more likely to have a disability. So we see large gaps in life expectancy between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. In Guatemala, for example, the difference in life expectancy is 13. So very, very big gap there. Australia, 20, some of these higher rates. Poor nutrition, it's one of the health issues that most affects Indigenous people. This is a circumstance of extreme poverty, but it's also because they often have a loss of land and territory that has a decline in abundance to traditional food sources. So we see poor nutrition. Latin America, malnutrition is 2 times the general population. We also see stunted growth in children. You'll see up to some areas a really high percentage of children who are stunted growth. It can be up to 20% or higher. And then food insecurity, having, for example, they may have be very susceptible to drought, and they may be very susceptible to disasters or floods. So it may have food security that also it was associated with this. Some of the non-communicable diseases, and we mentioned poor nutrition, but also diabetes. They have diabetes, which is over 50% in Indigenous adults over the age 35 have type 2 diabetes. We often call this we call adult onset. And this is correlated with higher rates of obesity. And often this is due to poor food sources, becoming dependent, for example, on not being able to grow their own crops and not to be able to have their own autonomy over their land. We've also seen this correlation with diabetes. Tuberculosis rate, I skipped over that, is 4 to 8 times higher than the national average. And tuberculosis is an infectious disease, but often it's associated disproportionately to disproportionately affects Indigenous around the world, but it's associated with poverty, poor housing, lack of access to medical care, drugs, and then cultural aspects and language differences, and just geographic remoteness. We also see substance abuse and depression and higher in other mental health diseases, such as suicide, which is highly prevalent. And this can be related to poverty and also marginalization and lack of cultural continuity. So we see this especially among younger people. And this is often due to some of the issues that are related to poverty. Indigenous women and children are especially hard hit. In Latin America, for example, the infant mortality rate, which is a proxy indicator of health among nations, different nations. We use a proxy indicator like a quick snapshot of health in a different comparing countries or regions or groups. So in Latin America, the infant mortality rate among Indigenous children is over 60% higher than non-Indigenous. The maternal child health, higher rates of mortality, in addition to infant mortality, is maternal mortality, and overall poor levels of health. The poor levels of health are going to be disproportionately high levels in addition to maternal and infant mortality, malnutrition, infectious diseases, malaria, for example, especially affecting them in terms of pregnant women and the impacts on the mother and the fetus. But also we see discrimination, mistreatment, a lack of respect for cultural practices, and it's something we call obstetrical violence, where there's actual not just discrimination, but actual practices that isolate and dehumanize women. For example, in Mexico, an ethnic Indigenous woman, Mazatec, was denied medical attention and was forced to give birth on a lawn from a health center in Oaxaca. El Salvador has obstetric violence, and often based with Indigenous women who will experience obstetric violence, which is discounting their concerns, mistreatment, not letting them do their cultural practices, bring somebody in, maybe the traditional birth attendant who's assisting them during pregnancy. So we saw a lot of examples of poor obstetric treatment to pregnant women. And this is everywhere. This is India, Peru. This is every Indigenous group has found this. So let's look at some Indigenous people we call global themes. We see unemployment to be a global theme that is related to often the discrimination and stigma with Indigenous people. Also, they might be isolated. Also, they often are given the poorest land to be relocated to, or have eventually been pushed onto, maybe put in reservations, or not being able to keep their land because I'll have that in the next slide, own it as collectively. We see violence. We see violence against them in terms of protecting their land. We see a lack of recognition of their rights, for example, to practice their culture, speak their language, engage in their traditional economies and political systems. That's often seen as a threat to other political systems. And that means they don't have political representation in some areas. And they have very severe climate change impacts. Good example is in Louisiana, the first community where the first people who have been relocated due to rising sea levels is here in Louisiana, the United States. And an indigenous tribe that was in the coastal area had to be relocated because of rising sea levels. So they're very much at the forefront of climate impacts. And on the right is a climate change example where climate change is threatening indigenous peoples that have to be threatening them in being relocated, but also through different things like heavy rainfall, hurricanes, food security from droughts. Some of the things that we see with indigenous people are related to their collective way of living or traditional way. So, for example, land and natural resource rights, they own land collectively. So this is they're very collective in nature, and this can affect the community and the peoples. So when you're trying to have land that's not owned by an individual and is owned collectively, it may be easier to, if you don't have a clear title on it, for example, they may be not able to hold on to that land. We see the decision making is often their own governance structures, and so this often means that they are not being recognized in the governance structure of that country that they live in or that region. Their traditional knowledge is very something that they share collectively, and this is one of the things I think is very important to know as in public health and in global health, but also it can be exploited. So, for example, their knowledge about traditional plants that they share among themselves. Maybe somebody comes in and wants to work with that traditional healer, find the plant they're using, isolate the pharmaceutical properties, and start reproducing that for treatment by a pharmaceutical company, and they don't get recognized. They don't get the profits. They don't get they don't get compensation for that because it's owned collectively. They have a high dependence on natural environment. I mentioned before, hunting, fishing, forest products. They often have a very good relationship with the natural environment, not just for survival, but also for the practices such as I mentioned, traditional medicine. Just want to say that it is the indigenous people have a set of human rights that are specific to indigenous people. And here's just one from the Declaration of Atitlan, which is like in Guatemala, that they have a right to land, water, and territory, self-determination, which means self-governance, and also these are essential for food security and food sovereignty. So these are some of the rights that they have that aren't always that respects their collective nature, but aren't always respected. So why haven't we addressed these issues? Well, first of all, the legacies of colonialism. They're often we know that, for example, colonialism is we've seen people, for example, uprooted from different lands. Often they were relocated to lands that didn't have value. And at the same time, if they start finding value in those lands, they sometimes are relocated from that land. So, for example, the indigenous people in Nicaragua that live in the area, the Mesquite in Honduras, but area in Nicaragua where they have a lot of autonomy. As soon as they started finding some of the land had value, they started wanting to encroach on that land. And so this is a legacy of colonialism, is that the outsider comes in and takes. And this is often about money, for example, putting a new dam in or putting a new port in. They've not been a priority. It's often some of their collective governance is a threat to power structures and systems. It's worrisome when such a big group gets power that doesn't practice the same way as non-Indigenous people. Their advocacy hasn't been strong enough or ignored. Sometimes, what do we do about an indigenous group that is not based in one country, but is spread over a group of countries? So who do you advocate for, the indigenous by a nation or by their indigenous collective, you could say, group, which is going to be maybe spread over 4 different countries. So it's hard to advocate because you may be having different advocate. They may have different power structures and successes in different countries. Same time, different countries may have less attention towards them. And a lot of times organizations and institutions don't really understand the solutions. So they may be, for example, they may not understand the collective ownership of land, or they may not understand the possible solutions that they often generate themselves. Remember, they are the best guardians of their land. They have a very good relationship with the land and understanding and traditional collective knowledge through centuries and managing it themselves. And yet, sometimes superficial interventions come in that, putting a dam to get more, to do water, to collect water, which upsets their own ecosystem and practice of their lands. So let's talk about addressing it. So one thing to have these inequities, but let's see what's going on. So World Health Organization has made a global plan of action for Indigenous people. 2024 is its first stage. I have a link to it if you're interested there. But this program, the Global Plan of Action, is in consultation with member states of the World Health Organization, but also Indigenous people and relevant UN and other multilateral agencies. And this is taking a life course, and it's particularly focusing on reproductive, maternal, child, adolescent health, vulnerable situations. So a plan of action for the health of Indigenous people to address these inequities. Some other things have come outcrops of addressing this is using inclusive tools. There's an Indigenous Health Indicators, which is it's a tool to assess different areas of Indigenous health, such as ecosystem health, belief, exposure, vulnerable risk. So it gives you a way to use inclusive types of tools to measure the different areas and to measure them in terms of baseline and see improvements. Some of the other things that have come out that are kind of more of a bigger area than just specific tools and frameworks is addressing the legacies of colonialism, such as land rights. For example, repatriating the land to people, which has happened in the Belize and the Toledo district. The Mayan communities have had some of their lands repatriated. Indigenous education. Having people learn in Indigenous in schools where their Indigenous language is practiced and that their Indigenous culture is included in the curriculum. And this is happening in places where, many in Latin America, I'm using that more as an example. We're also seeing it in Mexico where they're including Indigenous language into the education system. Interesting to see in the Yucatan, for example, you see signs both in Spanish, but also in Mayan, Yucatec Mayan. And Indigenous development. Indigenous people are not stagnant people. They're not living in the past. They are often want to be want to improve their access to the lands and roads and things like that. But the development may be different and based more on the and it should be considered with their beliefs and their collective decision making that's brought into the development. Shouldn't be outsider in. It should be from the inside or from the collective group to give advice to development and have a say in that. Some of the other things with development is that, considering they may not be so much involved with interest in economic development, but preservation of their land. For example, setting some of their land away so it can't be developed so they can still practice their traditional ways. In Belize, for example, there's a conservation area that's protected and it's named after a traditional healer. So it maintains that land to be able to practice their traditional medicine and practice their traditional customs and having a forest full of botanical treatments. So that's developed to them is that protection of that land, not putting a dam or a new road in. This picture I just want to highlight. I've actually this is from Belize. It's really beautiful. It's in Belize. It's a school. You see the Belizean flag, and you see you kind of look. It's a graduation ceremony. And this is looking at it with an Indigenous perspective. You see the young man graduating. He's in a robe, academic robe. You can see, but he also has he's wearing a traditionally woven sash. So here he's expressing his indigeneity where he's in graduating from a school. If you look around a little bit, you see this young man with a red bandana. There he is over his head. That is something that they wear when it's a spiritual guide, a representation of spiritual guide. And he's conducting a cleansing ceremony as part of the graduation. They are allowing this in the school in the graduation. This is what I mean by Indigenous education. And you look around a little bit, you start seeing the school principal. She's wearing traditional wear. It looks very, this is like the outfit you see a lot in Yucatan. You also see the community leaders, you see parents, and see they're sitting on a dirt floor, but there's still a graduation, and it's really, you see the Indigenous centric aspect of this graduation, a mixture of the traditional education systems, wearing a cap and gown, but also the spiritual healer wearing the spiritual clothes, the spiritual sash, and over that the Belizean flag flying over. So this is how you can incorporate this, and it's a really beautiful picture showing how this can happen, and land that's been repatriated. So what can an academic and student do? First of all, I promote scholarship and academic questioning and scholarship and study on Indigenous issues. First of all, as an academic, I have to check my own bias and misinformation. For years, you might accept this idea that people who, that the Indigenous community have high rates of alcohol abuse. And it's been explained often is that there's an alcohol gene. People who are Indigenous have this, they can't tolerate alcohol. That's actually not true. There is no alcohol gene. And most of the alcohol use and abuse is due to historical trauma. And when I mean, this was a bias or misinformation I held as an academic explanation. They have a gene, and then to realize there's no gene. It's actually historical trauma and decimation. Language, like keeping the language alive. And we have language classes here. We have a great Indigenous language scholar, Judith Maxwell, who teaches Kaqchikel and Quiche Maya. She goes and teaches in Guatemala, but she brings a Mayan speaker here to teach the classes. Keep these languages alive. We have service experience with Indigenous groups. So, for example, in the Grand Bayou Indigenous Village in South Louisiana, the coast, we have oyster shell deployment to help shore up their land against rising sea levels. And also, I have a Health and Equity Indigenous Peoples Scholar Society, where they involve with scholarship and listening to speakers and going to advance their knowledge and understanding of Indigenous issues. But we also got a trip to the United Nations this year, where they got to further their experience and interaction with Indigenous leaders to understand the issues and take them back and publish them and write about them and use that to promote the Indigenous understanding of these determinants. Removing harmful stereotypes in Indigenous and racial language. There's a great CDC Global Health Equity Glossary Terminology, being like a big name, that gives you terms you should use that don't that value Indigenous culture and doesn't erase Indigenous from the language. So, for example, instead of powwow is not preferred. You want to use meetings. And so, thinking about a great thing in Belize, they don't say Belize Mayan ruins anymore. They say Mayan sites or Mayan structures. Ruins is very negative. So learn those language aspects so that you can kind of remove it from the lexicon that cancels people or say they're in the past, they're ruined. Using Indigenous Peoples Day, which people also AKA Columbus Day, to present on health equity topics. I do presentations on this area. I can adapt it to environment, to maternal child health, you name it. Some of the things we raise awareness of, for example, a structural discrimination against eliminated of Native tribes in the United States, which residential schooling and assimilation. Many students have heard this when I introduce it. So some of the other things you can do is diversify your sources of scholarship. Like I said, thinking about some of the different ways you can get information on Indigenous causes. There's a great organization called Cultural Survival that has a publication that has great writing about Indigenous issues that you're not familiar with, for example, if you haven't started studying this. And so this is a great area to find Indigenous issues at the forefront being published on and what's current. Follow Indigenous content from Indigenous leaders or groups on Instagram. This is a great one, WM Indigenous. Supports things like Indigenous sovereignty and human rights. This is being an ally to Indigenous people by supporting their quest for recognition of their sovereignty and their human rights. I just want to go back here. Here's a picture of my Health Equity and Indigenous People Scholar Society trip to the United Nations. And I took 4 students. There's only three here. And this is us in front of the Sustainable Global Goals. And they got to hear about Indigenous rights advocates, the impact Indigenous people have, and climate change threats, protection of natural resources, and also just what makes you really excited about what's happening in the world of promoting Indigenous scholarship and practice and the people. Okay, Headlight. Sometimes it can be just disparaging working in Indigenous issues because there's been a lot of sometimes working with people in high level poverty, and if you see that some of the historical trauma and even the current areas of people losing their land and young activists being assassinated for protecting the land. So I'd like to look at headlight moments. And it's actually from a quote via Headlight, not Taillight, that I heard from Wilma Mankiller, who was a former principal chief of the Cherokee Nation. But here are some headlight moments. So the history was made, for example, when the United Nations made a General Assembly and made a specific area of the United Nations to a charter for the rights of the rights of the indigenous people. So this was a very important occurrence. It was in Geneva in 1977, and it was a UN mandate to address indigenous people's issues. Every year there's a meeting in April to have this gathering of the permanent forum for indigenous issues. And here's a picture of it here on the right. That's except for the 13th. There was another meeting after the first meeting, but it now has a UN agency for specific policies on indigenous people, and the United Nations has been a big ally, for example, supporting the legal process of repatriating land to indigenous Mayan and Southern Belize. So recognizing the rights of indigenous people. Here's some other, I'd like to say there's some shifting ground that we see. So Deb Haaland is confirmed in the United States as the first Native American Interior Secretary. I mentioned the United Nations Rights of Indigenous People. This is one of the Indigenous meetups, and that's Indigenous from the Caribbean Islands. Biden was the first president to actually mark Indigenous Peoples Day. So that's now something we recognize every year. Indigenous people have protected rights as asylum seekers. When people seek asylum, the indigenous people will have their special group for seeking asylum. In fact, asylum seekers have a right to have their case heard in their indigenous language. So a colleague of mine, and we'll shout out to Laura Hobson-Hurley, she's an indigenous anthropologist and ethnographer. She translates, for example, when a mosquito is seeking asylum into their indigenous language. There's recognized as intangible assets by UNESCO. UNESCO, we think of protecting buildings. UNESCO is now protecting beliefs, cultural practices, forest areas. So their language, for example, now is recognized by UNESCO as an intangible asset. I mentioned the other ones, Biden recognition, Interior Secretary. Here's the very exciting, here you notice it's published in Cultural Survival magazine. Here's the Maya winning land rights in international course. It's in Belize City, beautiful building. Where is she? She's over here. The Governor General in Belize, which is a former British colony and now is a Commonwealth, is a Indigenous lady, Lorelei. She's a friend and went to her wedding, but she's the first ever in Commonwealth history to have an Indigenous woman as the office of Governor General. Her Excellency, Lady Lorelei. That's a picture of her with the Queen, just before the Queen died, in Belize City, and I'm sorry, Belize, the capital of Belize, which is Belmopan. And we had the first Native American to go to space with the SpaceX mission, and that was sort of showing the progress we've seen from the Earth to the outer space. We see some indigenous headlights. I'll close that with thank you and questions, but I want to put this in memoriam of 77 indigenous defenders who were murdered in 2023 in Latin America alone. I know personally somebody who was assassinated for being a guardian of the Bosque, we call her a land defender. This every year they have a memoriam, and this was just from 2023. So this is dedicated in memoriam of those leaders. I'll stop for questions or comments, and I hope you enjoyed that presentation. And so I'll stop here for questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cropley. That was amazing. I want to thank you for your time. We do have a question in the Q&A. So, how can young people best promote allyship if we don't live in areas that have many natives?
Well, two things there. First, thank you for saying that being an ally. People who want to support Indigenous rights, they actually use word you want to be an ally, and that's a great way to promote promotion of Indigenous human rights, for example. First of all, you say where there's no Indigenous, and maybe there were once Indigenous there. So kind of understanding how the Indigenous may have impacted the area where you live. You look sometimes to see place names, and you'll see the place names might be in Indigenous language. But what about those place names that are now like Mount McKinley that used to have an Indigenous name? And so thinking about in the areas where the Indigenous people have been erased, their Indigenous name for, say, a mountain being replaced by a colonist name or a non-Indigenous name, thinking about that's a good place to start thinking about the area around you and where Indigenous people have been erased or replaced. But the other thing is just diversify your media. Start following different groups, such as on Instagram, about following different accounts of people who are promoting Indigenous rights. Cultural survival is a great place to start. I could have a list of Instagram accounts, and also including rethinking the scholarship on Indigenous people, reframing some of this when we hear the history of America and the United States of the idea that there was nobody here when people arrived. Well, there were people here, that they were displaced. Thinking about the attributes that Indigenous people have brought to things that we understand, that we're learning to understand, such as the threats of climate change. One of the things about Indigenous people, they are resilient. They were moved from the East Coast, for example, marched across America and stuck into Oklahoma. I don't know if you've looked lately, but the East Coast looks a lot different than Oklahoma. These are resilient people, and we understand that and promoting that attribute, and not just seeing them as something poor that needs to be saved, but this real strength that they've had and resilience, and just promoting that, writing a paper on it, bringing up to date, when retweeting or re-Xing, I guess you say, when it's Indigenous Peoples Day, put your voice out there and show some of the attributes that we are promoting here in terms of preservation of language, recognition of their rights, human rights, including autonomy and land custodian, being a custodian of their own lands. So these are some opportunities to be an ally, to diversify the media and speaking up on different areas to promote the Indigenous issues we've talked about.
Thank you, Dr. Cropley. We have another question in the Q&A. And guys, feel free to drop any questions that you have in the Q&A. It says, I'm sorry to hear about your friend who was killed in Latin America. Are our Cajun people considered as Indigenous?
Are Caucasian people as Indigenous?
Cajun, the
Cajun. Oh, that's
Cajun
a great name.
Louisiana
Well, you know what?
folks.
Cajun are not, I've never heard of Cajun being considered Indigenous, because first of all, they meet some of the definitions, that they have a common language, but they also have they have a certain connection with the land, so they meet a lot of the criteria. I've never heard them use the word Indigenous, and partly because they were people who were exiled. Just like Indigenous people are often put in exile, so were the Cajuns. And I've never heard them use the term Indigenous, but they meet a lot of those characteristics. So would you call them indigeneity, or do they have a connection that meets the term of indigeneity? I often think that indigeneity is best identified by the people who are living it. So good question. But they are people who have similar experiences. They were exiled. They kept their language. They live off the land. Now, when they got to the area where they were exiled in South Louisiana, there were Indigenous people there, but they often and they often had relationships in terms of commonalities in farming and practice and waterways and knowledge. Many names we have here in Louisiana are Indigenous names. So they encountered definitely Indigenous groups that they often would often have kind of partnerships in forming a new life down here. Some of the people in Louisiana, the tribes in Louisiana, were ones that were being relocated from the eastern coast, the big relocation, the Trail of Tears. Some of them dropped off the Trail of Tears and ended up in Louisiana. So would you consider them Indigenous? It's a lot about the identity. So good question.
Thank you, Dr. Cropley, for that thoughtful answer. The next question in the Q&A, what would you say are the most damaging things happening to the Indigenous community today in 2024?
Wow. It can go down a difficult path, which is hard to share sometimes with people who are just starting to understand these. And first of all, their land. They need the recognition of their land, their right to their land, the conservation of their land and their language. I would say threats to the loss of the language, but also threats to the loss of their land. And we see this as a big problem because of development. Again, they may not have a title to that land. It's been collectively owned. They don't have a written title. And the other thing is some Indigenous were never colonized. There's this kind of an identity here that we never were colonized. We always were kind of resistant. And so some of those people who were resistant are now finding conflicts with, for example, government that wants to put say a canal through their land, or put a dam, or or extract minerals such as gold. So I would say a big problem is defensive land, defensive language, and being able to practice their own language. Another problem is they are being affected when the most affected groups with climate change. So we're starting to see climate change asylum seekers. People are having to move away from land that is no longer usable because of drought, or because of sea level rise, or because of sometimes plant diseases that are spread. So really understanding that Indigenous people are on the forefront of climate change, both being the recipients of some of the climate change impacts, but they often are best understanding the land and how to manage it for climate change. At the same time, this is really interesting, Indigenous people are now affected by the climate change solutions, which means lithium mining in Indigenous lands. So really interesting kind of climate change three ways with the Indigenous, impacted three ways with the Indigenous people. So I would say support language, support land custodian, guardianship, and be aware of their their impact on climate change, but also that climate change solutions are actually affecting Indigenous people in terms of specifically lithium mining.
Thank you for that. We have one last question.
Sure.
It says, you used a lot of data showing Indigenous and not Indigenous.
Mm-hmm.
We have received pushback of utilizing data that identify data either attributed to Indigenous groups or labeled geographically to areas primarily inhabited currently by Indigenous groups. How can health disparities be discussed and looked at critically while also not attributing the disparity to being a characteristic of them being an Indigenous population rather than historical trauma, etc.?
Okay, it was a great thing. I didn't mention this talk, but Indigenous health equity and Indigenous health metrics are very unstudied. We don't have a lot of scholarship in this area. And when we do have scholarship, we're using I'm going to say use the word Western, it's not necessarily preferred. We're using Western understanding. Case in point, say you have this people living on a very low $2 a day, for example, and high poverty, but yet they may be growing their own their crops. They may be self-sufficient in terms of growing their own crops. So you're right, Indigenous as a group to be measured is very difficult. The better way to do it is what I call qualitative research. We have the emic versus the etic. And you want to go in and see, we call it felt need versus a real need. And when you go to a community, we would have a town hall, for example, and was working on a latrine project with CARE, the organization CARE, about latrine projects. We'd have a community meeting, and you'd sort of identify what their needs were. And so maybe they wouldn't think the needs were, say, latrines, but we knew that there was high use of water sanitation related diseases. But really hearing what their needs are and how they express them, and giving and using that medical anthropology approach of understanding their belief system and culture gives you a better idea of how to measure or assess things such as treatment seeking and fever. So we don't have a perfect instrument to measure some of these health metrics, but what it should be is always when you go into a community, go in that specific community itself, because they're all different, but they have some linkages to things like colonization, and find out what their needs are, and needs assessment that starts with them and then working out. Remember, they're collective. They don't want to meet you individuals. They want to meet as a group and discuss these things. So good question. We need better scholarship in this area. Indigenous is a catch-all term, but important to go to the area or group that you're working with and start there, town meeting or town hall or something, and work the way out. I don't know if that answered that question, but I like to say, where somebody says, do you have a research lab? And I always say, my lab is the community. That's where I start.
Thank you, Dr. Cropley. That was a very thoughtful answer. Now, we don't have any additional questions in the Q&A. If anybody wants to drop any last questions in the Q&A while we have you, we have about 4 minutes left of our session. Well, if we don't have any last questions, I want to thank you again, Dr. Cropley, for your time and for presenting to us this wonderful, wonderful seminar.
Thank you so much, and thank you for promoting the Indigenous issues. And being an ally and, really taking this and making this out of the classroom and into the community and getting them all the way to the moon.
Absolutely. We got one last chat saying this was great and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for listening.
All right. Thanks everyone for attending. I hope you have a great rest of your day.